Is there sort of a limit to the argument that it should be about capacity?
And in law, sometimes lines have to be drawn in it.
There is something different about this type of death.
There are all those philosophical thought experiments, which show us quite convincingly, I think, that we do think about those questions differently.
Yeah, and luckily, neither one of us are trying to solve this problem
Yeah.
here, and hopefully never will have to try to solve this problem.
Thank
There'll be
goodness we're not in charge
better
here.
and smarter people trying to figure that
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
All right, Adam, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me again. Did you want to just do a little bit of an introduction to yourself and work that you're doing at all?
My name's Adam Sandell. I am originally from the UK, moved to Canada 5 years ago. At the moment, my main job is working 2 weeks a month as a GP and emergency room doctor in Bella Bella, on the territory of the Healtsick Nation. I've been involved in medical assistance in dying work, carrying out assessments and providing medical assistance in dying for the last few years. Spent a couple of years as one of the BC Ministry of Health's medical advisors in relation to their oversight of medical assistance in dying in BC. And then another almost completely unrelated project for me is that I write about, and I'm writing a book about how to cope well and thrive doing tough work that you care about, which is a challenge for many people.
Right. And I've read that. So I'll definitely share some links to that because I think that's, like you said, it's important stuff for people who are doing sometimes difficult work. When it comes to difficult conversations, it's always best to prepare and then just jump right in. So I think maybe that's the best way to do it. So I had previously talked to a clinical ethicist and a constitutional professor about MAiD and mature minors, and they both made a pretty compelling case that in some instances, mature minors should have access to medical assistance in dying, and that a blanket ban is probably neither ethically or constitutionally defensible. What's your general position on mature minors making serious end-of-life decisions, and does that change at all when that decision might include MAiD?
When we say mature minors, what we're saying is children, people under the age of 18 or 19, who are able to make decisions for themselves. So we're usually thinking about teenagers, and of course, anyone who is thinking about the ability to make decisions in a medical context knows that it depends very much upon the individual decision that you're making. It seems to me that the only reason for distinguishing children, for distinguishing minors, when you're thinking about medical care, relates to decision making. Now, that's a complicated thing for children. It's not a black and white thing, and there are other people usually closely involved in children's decision making. But to stop rambling on this one, it seems to me that if you're 17 and anticipating a difficult death from a tragic cancer, or if you're 19 and in the same situation, and both of those two young people are able to make decisions for themselves, I find it very hard to justify MAiD being available to the 19-year-old and not being available to the 17-year-old simply on the basis of age. If we're saying that MAiD is an important option for people to be able to exercise control over the ends of their lives in terrible circumstances, then that seems to me at least as important for children who may be dying so early as it is for adults.
Yeah, and that sort of pulls together some points that I've had conversations with Eric and Emmett, and that's that there's nothing inherently different between being 17 and 9 months and being 18 and 1 day, and therefore the age requirement is a bit arbitrary, and maybe the criteria shouldn't be about age at all and should just be about capacity. But I think people reasonably have a bit of a concern about how low that age goes before we can all sort of agree that capacity kind of isn't something that a person has. is there sort of a limit to the argument that it should be about capacity, or is it really just an individual assessment that figures out, does this individual person have that capacity at whatever age they happen to be?
I don't want to claim to be an
Hmm.
expert in children's capacity. And in law, sometimes lines have to be drawn in a kind of semi-arbitrary place because there has to be a line, and that's what we have legislatures for. That's what we have MPs for, is in order to draw the line as best they possibly can, accepting that there's a degree of arbitrariness in it. The concern here for me is the ability for people to make decisions for themselves. And pediatricians and child psychiatrists and children's social workers and others with lots of expertise in supporting children in making decisions for themselves and working with families together and in evaluating children's capacity are very good at it. And it seems to me that I'm not sure the situation is helped by introducing another criterion. If what we're concerned about is that only children who are able to make independent decisions for themselves with legal capacity have MAiD, and we're talking about tiny numbers here. Then it seems to me that ought to be the criterion, and adding in an arbitrary age cutoff, I think is likely to do much more harm by excluding from MAiD people about whom there can be no doubt that they have the ability to make that decision, while not actually protecting anyone, given the safeguards that we would have with capacity assessments, with skilled and specialist, child focused, family focused capacity assessments.
Yeah. I did talk to a pediatrician about MAiD and mature minors, and they said that they were worried about expanding MAiD to include mature minors, but that they were more worried about not expanding it
Yeah.
to that group. Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, and that's a much more concise way of saying what I think I was just rambling away about. Yeah, I would agree exactly about that. I mean, these are all, everything about MAiD is a difficult decision to make, isn't
Hmm.
it? But you
Sure.
need to think about the consequences of not making that decision too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just jump into the idea that mature minors in Canada can sometimes refuse life-saving treatment, and should that same standard be applied to MAiD? And I'm assuming now, just based on your previous answers, that yeah, that your answer might be yes. And why would that be?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's interesting. Some philosophers, but not all, draw a distinction between
Hmm.
refusing consent for something and requesting consent for something. And that's that goes to sort of core ethical philosophy, questions of ethical philosophy that I'm not sure kind of help us in this conversation. For practical purposes, it seems to me that for any specific decision at any particular moment, um, you know, either you can make that decision or you can't. Now, of course, that's not really black and white. There's gradations of it, um, but um, but it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to me whether that's refusing something that may save your life or requesting something that may end your life. It seems to me that for all of the kind of welfare reasons, for all of the compassionate reasons that many of us think that MAiD ought to be available in certain circumstances, those circumstances pretty clearly can apply to, thankfully, a tiny number of children in really wretched situations.
Yeah. So you were mentioning that depending on the philosophical lens that you're looking at this, there could be, you could see a difference between refusing, allowing someone to refuse a life-sustaining treatment, or actively choosing to have an assisted death. Is that is that leaning into why people have maybe a bit of resistance to allowing MAiD for mature minors, but are okay with them refusing life-sustaining treatment, or is there any other kind of anything else going on that you can think of?
There's a gut thing there going on, isn't there? And One of the things it seems to me that we need to think about when we're thinking about MAiD is what it is like for and what it does to the people who provide MAiD. Um, and you know, it would be it's always a big deal for me when I have provided MAiD to someone. It always feels like a big and momentous thing to do, and it's you know, usually with someone I've got to know pretty well before, you know, before getting there. Doing that for a child, you know, would be a huge thing, I think. And yet, at the same time, if this is a child who is experiencing intolerable suffering, and especially a child who is terminally ill, and a child who's kind of clearly made this decision well and with capacity, then you know, then I think my compassion would be up to that. But that is different from, you know, a child saying, I just don't think I can do the chemo anymore. You know,
Mhm.
thanks, but no thanks, because it,
Right.
you know, it implicates others in the provision of the MAiD. And that seems to me, if you're kind of thinking holistically about the ethics of this, then you need to think about how it impacts on other people. I'm not here making a I suppose I'm nodding at those with whom I disagree, but I think their point needs thought, who say this isn't something that doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners should be involved in, medical
Right.
assistants in dying. This, you know, we're there to save lives and heal. We're not there to end lives. Now, I actually don't agree with that, but I think there's a point there that needs
Mhm.
some thought about what it is that we're doing and what our role ought to be in people's lives and in society.
Yeah, I think so. I'm a nurse, and one of the things that I do is teach other nurses and other healthcare staff to support someone through an assisted death. So we're not participating in the actual provision of an assisted death, but we're peripherally there to support other people. And there is something different about this type of death, and that's one of the things that I always try to reiterate, even when someone approaches it with, yes, I've been around a lot of death. I'm quite comfortable. I understand why this person's choosing this. And we're talking about adults here. Even then, after the experience, I think they realize that this was different than even what they might have anticipated.
Hmm.
So there is definitely something different about an assisted death that we do have to take into consideration about the effects it does have on healthcare staff and how they approach their work. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think the effects on the healthcare staff are anything like the most important consideration when we're thinking about MAiD for mature minors or for anyone
No.
else. Um, I guess I'm just kind of trying to get at why there is something different between someone refusing treatment and someone requesting something that's going to very rapidly bring their life to an end.
Yeah, and I think the feelings that healthcare staff might have are I think probably mirrored in the public's perception of the difference between refusing life saving treatment and actively allowing someone to
Yeah,
choose this. I
yeah,
guess is the point I
yeah.
was trying to make maybe.
And we have a gut, you know, even if from a kind of, you know, utilitarian philosophy perspective, we don't think there's any difference between refusing life-saving treatment and accepting life-ending treatment. There are circumstances in which our gut tells us that there's something very, you know, very different about those two things. There are all those philosophical thought experiments of pushing the person off the bridge in order to stop the oncoming train,
Right.
you know, which show us quite convincingly, I think, that we do think about those questions differently.
Yes.
So,
So yeah, so I think the biggest objection that I hear, and I think we've been talking about a lot here, is that idea that minors might lack the capacity to make some of those serious life and death decisions, including ones about MAiD. But maybe I'd just ask, what is it that you're looking for when you are assessing a person's ability to make some of these difficult decisions? And can you anticipate any sort of unique challenges those capacity assessments might uh, make when it comes to mature minors with their consent for decisions like this?
yeah, the assessment for capacity is expressed in slightly different ways in different contexts and in
Mhm.
different legal systems, but it involves elements of being able to understand all of the information relevant to the decision that you're making. all the information you need in order to make the decision, um, and to appreciate consequences. In other words, to understand what the consequences are of this decision or that decision, or of not making a decision at all, and then to be able to weigh all of that up in some kind of meaningful way to reach a decision, and then to be able to communicate that decision. Um, and your decision doesn't have to be sensible or one with which others would agree, but it does have to have been reached in that way. You have to have understood, grappled with, kind of weighed up, and communicated, what your decision is. And there are other bits to that, like that if someone is having difficulty making decisions, we need to support them in whatever way we possibly can, to allow them to make that decision. A way that often comes up when you're looking after elderly people, for example, is that sometimes time of day is terribly important for someone, someone elderly, that they can be functioning much more highly at one time of day, and not at another time of day. How is that different for children? The principles are not different at all. But there are a number of differences for children. And again, I don't claim any kind of special expertise in this, except that as a GP, you're always thinking, does this kid who's come to see me on their own have the ability to make this decision, or do we need to be involving someone else? But first of all, children are often very influenced by others, most obviously parents, but also friends, and that's usually a very supportive thing, but not always. And you want to make sure that that whatever is going on there is going on in a way that most supports the child to make the decision, including, to adequately weigh all of the things that need weighing. Um, Another consideration with children seems to me to be about articulacy, and that children often are just less experienced and yet less developed than you and I are in talking about how we have made our decisions. So there can be a difference between what's going on inside a child's head, um, and what you're hearing now, and that applies to everyone, but I think it especially applies to young people who may not be used to chewing these things over, especially with a middle-aged man like me. So those all need quite careful consideration, and those issues need quite careful consideration to make sure that you're really best supporting the child to make a decision, and also best enabling yourself to evaluate their ability to make a decision.
I'm going to ask you in a minute about involvement of family and
Mm,
coercion and things like that. But I do want to just quickly ask about knowing, you mentioned that obviously neither one of us are experts in assessing children, or even this whole idea of MAiD and mature minors. But knowing that if this were to ever become a legal option, there would be an entire sort of group of experts weighing in on the eligibility and safeguards for mature minors. Um, as a bit of an expert in sort of the current MAiD eligibility and safeguards, are there any additional safeguards you think for mature minors that might be reasonable that you might endorse in order to ensure that we are getting an accurate reading of someone's capacity?
I mean, the one obvious one, for me, would be that if there is any doubt, um, someone involved in the assessment ought to have considerable expertise in assessing capacity, and but more generally working with children.
Right.
Um, Whether that's something that needs to be written into primary legislation, or whether that can be dealt with by um, provincial and college guidelines, um, I don't know, or particularly care. I think the important thing is that there is appropriate guidance on that's followed,
Mhm.
um, and also whether that's necessary for the 17-year-old who clearly can make decisions for themselves. I don't have a particular problem with their GP being one of the people. Um, uh, one of the people making the assessment, even if or their palliative care doctor or whoever it may be, even if they don't profess particular expertise in assessing capacity in children. But for someone where there's more doubt, for a young person where there's more doubt, it seems to me that it is really important that it's someone with expertise in working with and assessing capacity in children.
Okay. Tell me if my understanding of this sounds right. So currently, for track two cases where someone does not have a reasonably foreseeable natural death, there is language in the law that says that if neither of the assessors are experts, or and that could be experts in determining capacity, given that person's particular circumstances, they have a legal requirement to bring in an expert consultation. But even though that is not legally required under track one, when someone has a reasonably foreseeable natural death, when there is doubt about anything unclear about the maybe the medical prognosis or ability to communicate or capacity, that there's sort of a self-regulation within the medical community to say I need an expert to come in and help me out with this, and that's almost sounds to me like what you're saying is already there and would be maybe what would happen with mature minors anyway, based on current legislation. Am I missing anything there?
No, I don't think you are missing anything there, and I would hope so. I think, I mean, I think, that what counts as expertise um,
Mm.
admits of a variety of interpretations. Um, and I guess, from my personal perspective as someone who has an opinion, I would just be concerned that it were framed in a way that ensured that children were adequately protected. Um, I, I, and there are two concerns here, aren't there? One is the concern about a child um, receiving MAiD who didn't actually have the capacity to make that decision, but was judged as doing so. Um, and the other is a child who didn't receive MAiD because the child was judged not to have the capacity to make that decision, but in fact, with appropriate support and assessment, could have made that decision and would have received MAiD, and therefore had their wishes respected. And so that those are both concerns. And yes, I think I guess what you're saying is you know is right, that there's already a framework for this. We just kind of need to make sure that it works adequately.
Yeah, because my understanding is the current, I don't think it's quite in the legislation, but in sort of the guiding documents and standards of practice, is that the expert doesn't need to be a specialist in any particular field. They just have to be able to sort of self-determine, I have enough expertise and experience, where maybe what you're suggesting is that maybe be clarified a little bit more as to what expert means in certain contexts.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, I think the detail of how kind of legislation and guidance um, are drafted is that's not a sort of major concern for me. Um, I and it's interesting. You're right to point out that expertise requirement is spelled out in the legislation in respect of track two cases, so cases where natural deaths are not reasonably foreseeable. It's not set out at all in relation to track one cases, although if I'm carrying out an assessment in a track one case for someone with a condition that I just don't feel I have sufficient expertise in to make a determination, of course I'm going to speak to a specialist. That would seem to me to be, just obviously remiss. And in the same way, I kind of almost feel it doesn't need spelling out that if you're, carrying out a capacity assessment in a 14-year-old, where it's tricky, where it's not obvious what the answer is, then you're going to want to get someone who has expertise in assessing capacity in teenagers to help with that process.
Right. Yeah. So to go back to one of the things that you sort of mentioned about sort of parental guardian involvement, what
Mm.
practical role do parents and guardians play in mature minor decisions regarding serious medical decisions, such as refusing life-sustaining treatment?
I mean, usually it's very supportive. I should say I don't have a lot of experience of looking after
Mhm.
children. Thankfully, most of us don't have a lot of experience of looking after children with terminal illnesses. Normally, because they are, thankfully very rare. Um, Normally, those small number of children whose lives I have been involved in a small way, with terminal illnesses. You know, first of all, these are kind of always complex and unique situations, and generally families are closely involved and supportive and wonderful at supporting their children to make decisions that they want to make. And there are many situations where children are just too young to. I mean, then there's a tiny number, but there are situations where children are just too young to make decisions for themselves, and that's clear. Um, Sometimes family dynamics are really complex, and there are concerns that people have different interests, and those are not adequately being reconciled, and those are extraordinarily difficult and painful situations that I think pediatricians and nurses and social workers and others kind of do their very best to help everyone navigate. And those I guess are the situations that we'd be most concerned about in relation to MAiD for mature minors.
Yeah. This it sounds like this is not unlike a situation where an adult says that they don't want immediate family member to be aware that they're pursuing MAiD or possibly even going to have an assisted death. And my understanding is that that almost always will trigger a discussion about
Yeah.
what that means for that person, and is there some way to support that person with maybe connections with family around that decision. That almost sounds like that might be the same situation, but even maybe more often and deliberate if a mature minor were to be making a decision on their own.
I think that must be right. And I'm slightly hesitant to talk with too much authority about this because the number of cases I've been involved in is so low that I'm kind of drawing inferences from individual cases. This is not like talking to someone who specializes in palliative care for children, for example. I'm a GP and I see the stuff that GPs see, and I've
Yeah.
been doing it for a long time. But again, wonderfully, the number of terminally ill children I've seen has been very small indeed. But I think that's right. And I mean, there's a general rule of thumb, isn't there, that it's almost always best to talk about stuff, or at least in healthcare. If there's something that needs talking about it, then that needs talking about, then it needs talking about, and that's a general kind of rule of thumb. And it's interesting. One of the things I find myself often saying um, to adult MAiD patients where there's a child involved is their imagination is almost certainly worse than reality. And actually, they can probably cope really well with you explaining all of this. And I'm happy to be part of that conversation. And
Yeah.
if they would like to be there, then they, think seriously about it. We are on the side of wanting to protect children, and that's a kind of noble instinct, it seems to me, but it's often actually not the right instinct. Usually getting stuff out and talking about it works better.
So then this idea of coercion is something that I think people do worry about as well. So a mature minor coming to a decision like this with under some coercion or some undue influence, again, not unlike what MAiD assessors currently have to navigate with adults. How do you ensure that someone is truly making an autonomous decision regarding something like MAiD?
You do your best. We have to acknowledge that it is possible that we're sometimes missing coercion. I think it's unlikely, but there is no gold standard. There is no, blood test you can do for coercion that gives you a definite answer. Um, with adults, I always speak to people on their own, and ask questions that are quite expressly kind of designed to figure out how people have reached their decision and whether they've been subject to any coercion. And almost invariably, if there is coercion, it's people trying to coerce them not to have MAiD when they're
Yes.
very clear that that is indeed what they want. Um, uh, the thing that concerns some commentators is about people choosing MAiD in part because they don't want to be a burden to others. Now, I've never knowingly encountered anyone who's chosen MAiD solely for that reason. But it's not uncommon for people to mention it as one of a number of reasons
Yes.
why they don't want, they don't want to go through the suffering, but they also don't want to put family members through the suffering. And
Hmm.
I think if you do believe in autonomy, then you have to have a certain amount of respect for that. Again, if we say that people are able to make up their own minds, then they're able to make up their own minds. And that, there's nothing about that reason that is inherently unacceptable, although it's certainly a lot more comfortable when they've got other bigger reasons for wanting MAiD for themselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's say you were, and again, this is probably more hypothetical than anything, just because it is probably so rare. What would happen if you were to start to think, or you were unsure that that someone was not being coerced or under some undue influence? What would happen there? Even in adult situation, I should say.
Yeah, I haven't been in that situation. Um, I um, I would. I mean, the first thing would be a conversation with them on their own, and I think my next steps would be very guided by the content of that conversation. But if I felt that they were being coerced and weren't wanting to talk to me about it, um, then I certainly wouldn't be going ahead with MAiD at that point. Um, I might start by having a, I mean, I'm thinking out loud here. I might start by having a conversation with um, with the other MAiD assessor, because of course there are always two
Right.
independent MAiD assessors, but that independence doesn't prohibit, and in fact often it can be helpful to have conversations to try and ensure that you both have all the information you need. Um, and then I think depending on the circumstances would be thinking about how we best figure this out. And there's a whole bunch of implications. You know, one is understanding adequately what's going on. Um, and another is the potential that this person is being abused. You know, this if someone is trying to coerce someone else against their will to have MAiD, then that you know that's a form of abuse that is a serious concern. So you know, I might be speaking to lawyers, to ethicists, to social workers, you know, depending on the circumstance, in order to ensure that this person is adequately safeguarded. But this is, you know, I think that such a situation would be so dependent on the individual circumstances. It is very hard to answer in general terms about how I would approach it.
Yeah, I think that's telling that it is so rare to come across that in practice that this almost, in most cases, needs to be a hypothetical conversation for most people. Although we do know that that it does happen. There are cases where people have been declined because of fears of
Yeah,
coercion. That's reported.
yeah,
So we do know that some people are found not eligible because of that. But
yeah,
I think that is telling that you're having to hypothetically think about what that might be like.
yeah.
I want to ask about um, MAiD for mature minors and the difference between those who might have a reasonably foreseeable natural death or a terminal condition and those who might not. Is there any reason that you think that mature minors should only have access if they have a reasonably foreseeable natural death or some sort of short prognosis? I think that's one of the suggestions that I think people have made as a safeguard. To say there must be some definitive short-term prognosis to actually allow this to go forward. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a hard one, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't struggle with the idea of MAiD being available to children with capacity who have a reasonably foreseeable natural death. In fact, I struggle with the idea that it is not available to children in those circumstances, for all of the reasons that we spent time talking about at the beginning of this conversation. Um, you know, my instinct Um, my instinct is that to make a distinction between adults and children with capacity um, for track two cases is unjustifiable. Suffering is suffering, however old you are. Um, and capacity is capacity, and you've got it. You should be able to make that decision. So that's my immediate instinct. How might, I mean, you know, let's just kind of try and explore the counter argument to this. How might it be different for a child? One way in which it might be different for a child is that you are changing when you're a child. You know, you're not crystallized. In fact, we know that we're never crystallized, but there's an awful lot of growth and development and adaptation and maturation that is going on in people under the age of 18, and actually people in the few years after 18 as well. And you know, we know that. people who suffer life-changing injuries later in life as well, at your age or my age, um, can be horrified by their circumstances in the initial months, and then actually come to adapt remarkably well to their new circumstances once they've got over that, what psychiatrists call adjustment reaction.
Mhm.
And things look very different at that point, and this includes, for example, older people for whom the idea of going into long-term care is completely unacceptable, and then they're there and they actually discover that life's a lot more fun than they thought it was going to be,
Mhm.
which absolutely isn't everyone at all, but there are some who are like
Mhm.
that. So you might be concerned about kids um, with severe and enduring disabilities who are unable to cope with it at the age of 14, when lots is changing anyway, and many 14-year-olds struggle to cope with lots in life for very understandable reasons. It's a really hard age to be. um, who might adapt to that significantly, over the coming years. So it seems to me there is a difference there, and I want to reach a definite conclusion here on this, and I don't think I can. I think the first conversation for us to have is this thing about terminal illness, and then what do we do about disability when natural death is not reasonably foreseeable? I think I'm still grappling with that one myself.
Yeah, and luckily, neither one of us are trying to solve this problem here,
Yeah.
and hopefully never will have to try to solve this problem.
Thank
There'll be
goodness we're not in charge,
better
eh?
and smarter people trying to figure that
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, so last question on MAiD. One of the objections that I hear a lot is about if we just had better palliative care, thinking about adults, people wouldn't feel the need to ask for MAiD. How do you respond to that? And how do you see that relationship between palliative care and MAiD?
I would like the relationship between palliative care and MAiD to be one of mutual collaboration and support and respect, and for those two services to be well integrated as they are in some places and in some people. Um, the argument is factually incorrect. So we know that when people have state of the art, high quality palliative care available to them, that some still request MAiD. So it is not true that palliative care can deal with all. Adequate palliative care will mean that no one wants to have MAiD. Um, but there is a point there, isn't there? That if people are, that healthcare provision is not what we want it to be. Just as we agonize over people requesting MAiD because their social supports are not what we would want them to be. And although palliative care specialists are sometimes criticized for um, resisting MAiD on the basis that it will result in fewer resources being allocated to palliative care, which my understanding is also actually factually incorrect when this has been studied.
That's true.
Nevertheless, it is right that
Mhm.
the availability of MAiD ought not to detract from our adequately funding and providing high quality palliative care for anyone who needs it. So it
Mhm.
seems to me those are two things that should go hand in hand, and there shouldn't, there shouldn't be frictions or conflicts between palliative care and MAiD. I would like MAiD to be seen as a part of palliative care for those who request it. And I don't see either threatening, either threatening the other.
S- Um, so certainly there needs to be more resources and funding to palliative care, as there probably needs to be in many different areas of healthcare. Whenever I've been into a children's hospital, they certainly feel like they're quite well funded, maybe not as much as we would want. And I would imagine that includes their palliative approach to care as well. Is this as big a concern, a lack of funding, lack of resources for children that are approaching end of life and needing palliative care? Do you think?
So my experience in the UK was similar to yours, that palliative care for children was actually pretty well resourced
Hmm. Yeah.
compared to some other services. But I just don't have the expertise to answer that question.
Yeah.
I think we just need to agree that the availability of MAiD should never detract from adequate funding of alternatives. And in fact, I think for those of us who are concerned that MAiD be available in appropriate circumstances, we have a duty to ensure that everything else is available to people. I It's sometimes when I talk to people about MAiD, it sometimes surprises people to hear, but I think it's an important point to make, that some of my most satisfying experiences as someone who's involved in assessments and provision for MAiD, especially in track 2 cases, people whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable, have been investing time and energy helping people to explore alternatives to MAiD, as a result of which they've come back to me and said, okay, yes, I want to stick with this for a little bit longer. This is I didn't know that this was available to me. And I have some hope that this is going to help. And I please leave me alone for a bit, and I'm going to pursue this for now. And I think, great, that to
Yeah.
me, that's a more of a success than providing MAiD.
Yeah.
So
I,
and that's how we should be approaching this. We
yeah.
should be huge supporters of palliative care provision.
I think that's a point that's often missed, is that whenever someone is going through an assessment, there is always an exploration of what are the means that are available to relieve that suffering, including palliative care. And I don't think that there's a single MAiD provider in the country that wouldn't prefer to refer someone who wanted to accept that care to another service, whether that's palliative care or some other sort of supports to relieve their suffering, rather than assist them with an assisted death. I can't imagine that anyone would not say that that's a win for everyone.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
No, I couldn't agree more. So
yeah.
we should, palliative care and MAiD ought to be cheering each other on.
Mm-hmm. So that's all my questions about MAiD and mature minors. But I know you do a lot of work that is not related to MAiD. What are you working on, and sort of what interesting things are you doing right now?
So my main job is working on an Indigenous reserve as a GP and an emergency room doctor, and that is I've been a doctor for I think 26 years now, and it's the highlight of my career. It is an honour and a privilege to be working with and for the community that I work for. The other big project that I have on the go at the moment is writing a book um, about how to cope with and how to thrive in a job that you may care about, but that you find tough and challenging. Um, and this is, my audience is my target readers are nurses and doctors and social workers and teachers and legal aid lawyers and academics and managers and people working for non-profits and people who do stuff they care about and went into it thinking this is going to be wonderful, and then actually find that they're working really hard and not always achieving what they want to be achieving, and sometimes suffering from imposter feelings, and sometimes working in teams that don't feel completely functional. And I guess has seemed important to me because that's been the story for much of my own career. And I think this work that the people who do work that matters do really does matter. Um, and there's a tiny number of people who just manage to swan through it all absolutely fine. And I spent a lot of years studying what it is that they do,
Mm,
and learning from them,
yeah,
and now trying to share those ideas with other people, because those ideas have transformed my life and I've used them to help transform other people's working lives. So there's a book in this, and then a Substack email that I write every 2 or 3 weeks. It's a little bit irregular, that people can sign up for, with just little ideas in there that people can use to improve their working lives significantly.
yeah. I couldn't encourage people more to check out the Great Works Substack. It's something I read every single article that you put up, or every newsletter you put up. It's been so valuable in many ways. Definitely, one of the personal ones was that imposter syndrome, because me doing things like this is very unnatural for me, and why am I talking to people with so much experience, and being able to work through my own feelings on that, among all the other good advice and ideas that you have in there, has been so helpful. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Um,
Thank you so much for saying that, Paul.
No problem. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before I let you go?
No, just while we're here, can I give people
Yeah.
the web address if they are interested in signing up for that newsletter that you were just
Yeah,
talking about?
absolutely. I'll actually put it up on the screen. I'll put
Okay.
links in
Yep.
there. But yeah,
It's
absolutely. I will
it's
share that.
here's the moment it can go on the screen: www.adamsandell.com. That's www.adamsandell.com.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so
Thank,
much for taking the time to do this with me. I really
thank
appreciate
you.
it.
And Paul, I don't think you're
All
an
right.
imposter at all. I look up to you as someone who knows an awful lot more about some bits of this than I do. So I really enjoyed the conversation.
Just sucking in all that information from all the people that I get to talk to and read about. So
Well,
thank
it's
you.
great. It's
All right.
great work that you're doing.
All right. Have a great night.
Thanks so much. You too.